We already talked about the idea of the motor program, which is basically the structure that underlies our planning of actions. And in that motor program is both information about the muscle commands that are being sent to the muscles, but then also a copy of those commands that then get linked up with the visual feedback that comes back, the kinesthetic feedback, the way that our body feels and the way it's supposed to feel depending on the action that we try to perform. So the motor program is sometimes also referred to as the forward model, and this really helps us to stay on track when we perform actions in the world. Now, what's interesting about the motor program is that we set this up is a structure that we set up in anticipation of an action, and it allows us to act more quickly and to compare, as I said, the outcome of an action to what we intended for it to happen. So the forward model is not a term for this, but what's really interesting is that we can also use our own motor programs to actually anticipate the actions of other people. And this is sometimes referred to as the notion of shared representations. Shared representations have been established based on research from motor priming, and we've seen there already an example where people can perform actions more quickly if what they're watching happens to match what they're happening to have to do themselves. But this also helps in our ability to mentally represent actions that are made by other people. So the same motor representations are actually formed when we see someone else act as if we were performing the same actions ourselves. And most interesting about this is that we've actually discovered neurons in the brain called mirror neurons that provide a direct link between perception of action and the production of action. Mirror neurons were first discovered by a group of Italian researchers, the head of whom was Giacomo Rizzolatti. And interestingly enough, they were actually trying to work on pretty basic studies that were looking at how neurons fired depending on the direction of movements of a monkey. So they wanted to know, if a monkey has to reach to the right, does a neuron fire? If it reaches to the left, does a neuron fire? Very similar to how we saw in visual perception that we have different cells in the visual cortex that will actually fire for different orientations of lines. They wanted to do the same sort of work, but then for our movements, and they wanted to know, does a neuron fire for one direction of movement but not for another direction of movement? Interestingly enough, supposedly at some point during that work, they wanted to take a break, but the recording apparatus was still actually running, so they could actually hear the bopping of the firing of neurons. And as this was happening, one of the graduate students supposedly reached for either a nut or a banana that was sitting on the table for the monkey to reach. And the monkey was watching that reaching movement by this person. And just from watching the movement, the neurons actually started to fire. And fortunately, these people had their eyes open and realized this. And they started to realize, wow, not only do our neurons actually fire depending on the direction of our own movements, neurons, the same exact neurons, can actually fire when we observe movements produced by somebody else. And that then led to very systematic research on mirror neurons. So if you look at the firing rate of a neuron or of a mirror neuron, when there's observation of action, here's the idea. They had monkeys reach for objects, typically, of course, bananas and stuff like that. And during those reaches, they recorded from a particular neuron. And as you see, as the monkey is preparing to move, there starts to be an increase in firing rate. Then there's a grasping movement. And during that grasping movement, there's a much higher firing rate in that particular neuron. So that is when the monkey performs the action themselves. Now they found that that exact same neuron, during the observation of that action, so the action is made by somebody else, you don't get the motor preparation activation, so there's no preparation to make the movement, but as the movement itself is happening, those neurons, that particular neuron in this case, is firing just as much. What's even more interesting is that some of these mirror neurons are actually sensitive to the intention that's behind the action. So they played around with whether the grasping hand was going towards an object or towards some empty spot on the table, but not towards an object. And they discovered that for some of those neurons, they're specifically activated when the reach is actually produced towards some sort of object. So you see here, this neuron is, motor preparation is not happening, but from the observation of the action, even if they can't see the end of the movement, just from knowing that the object is there, this mirror neuron is firing. Same exact hand movement, but knowing that there's no object, this particular neuron was actually not firing. So that's interesting because this actually suggests that that neuron is some ways coding for the intention of this actor that's moving. Is this an object-directed action? In that case, this neuron fires. If it's not an object-directed action, then this neuron did not fire. So these are neurons in the premotor cortex, and they probably help us with predicting the action outcomes of movements that we are observing rather than those that we are producing alone. Now, this is all single cell work in monkeys. Can we find evidence for a mirror neuron system in the human brain? And it turns out that even though the evidence is less direct, yes, we can. So what people have done is studies along the lines of the following. And in this study, people were put in an MRI scanner, and then they were asked to watch movies of hand movements, mouth movements, and foot movements. And we know from plenty of work that when we make hand, mouth, and foot movements ourselves, those actually rely on slightly different areas in this motor strip in the primary motor cortex. So there's actually such a thing as a foot area, a hand area, and a mouth area. And as you see, the mouth area is actually quite large. The reason for that is that even though we don't think about it much, movements of the mouth are extremely intricate and actually involve a lot of muscles that help us produce all sorts of different speech patterns. What they did in this study is just have people lay still in the scanner while they watch these different movies. And as you can see, you get the same reliable activation across our own motor strip in primary motor cortex as if people were producing those movements themselves. What's interesting too is that if there was no object involved, you just got primary motor cortex. When they added an object to the movements people were watching, you also got additional activation in the parietal cortex up here, or from the other view over here. And that makes sense because we've already seen that the parietal cortex is actually involved in spatial orienting, and it's involved in aligning our own bodies with the world, and the world of course includes objects. So you see here that the systems that become activated as we watch actions are actually very, very similar, if not the same, as the systems that become activated when we produce those actions ourselves. Another study looked at activation in people's motor cortex depending on their expertise. And in this study, they very nicely demonstrated that your own motor expertise actually influences how much the motor cortex becomes activated during watching other people's movements. What did they do here? They took a group of professional ballet dancers. They took a group of professional capoeira dancers. And if you don't know capoeira, I would say look it up on YouTube, but it's basically a Brazilian form of dance that looks nothing like ballet. It's more almost like a martial art type of dancing. So ballet and capoeira share many things in that they're both dances and they both involve this, exquisite timing and so forth, but nonetheless their form looks very different. When people were put in the scanner of those two different groups and a group of controls who couldn't really dance much, like myself, they found that when ballet dancers watched movies of ballet, their motor cortex became more activated than when they watched movies of capoeira. And for the capoeira dancers, exactly the opposite. If they watched movies of ballet, their motor cortex was less activated than when they watched movies of capoeira. For the controls, you see that there was no difference. So this is really interesting because it suggests that our own motor expertise influences how we see movements of other people. If they match onto our own motor repertoires, there is a larger activation in our own brains, and we in some ways have a better understanding of what's going on. Now, of course, we sometimes try to use these bodily movements to actually predict the action outcomes. So, for example, a goalie in a World Cup match, in a penalty shootout, is of course trying to read the movements of the shooter so that they can then predict where this ball is going to go and they can try to stop it. And that again is about a very rapid link between perception of an action and then aligning your own actions with that particular perception and forming predictions based on it. Related to this, at the level of sort of representations, is the idea of common coding. So the idea is that if there's similarity, some sort of match between the observer's action repertoire and the observed action, then we can simulate that action, form predictions based on it, and then we can try to predict the outcomes of other people's actions. And that this happens has been demonstrated really nicely in the last study I will discuss, which is a study on basketball. And in this study, they took 3 different groups. They took a group of expert players who obviously could perform these motor actions very well. They took a group of expert watchers, otherwise known as sports journalists, who couldn't necessarily play very well, but had watched a lot of basketball. And they took a group of novices who had no interest in basketball whatsoever. And what they did is that they showed them movie clips of people taking shots. And you see in this frame that, there was a starting point, they were taking free throw shots, and you see frame by frame that at some point the ball gets released. And these movies were then stopped at different points in time. So for example, they may show the first 3 frames or the first 4 frames. They paused the movie, and then they asked each of those groups to predict whether the ball was going to go in or not. And of course, they varied whether the shot was actually in or not, but they paused it at different points in time and then just asked them to predict whether it was going to go in or not. And what they then looked at was the ability to correctly predict whether a shot was going to be a hit or not, depending on whether people were expert players, expert watchers, or novices. And what they found, and these graphs are a little complicated, so let me just get to the bottom line. They found that very early on in the movement, actually right from the get-go, you see here that even based on frame 1, experts were better able to predict whether the shot was going in or not compared to novices, even right here. And the further along the action, the better they were able to, relative to the novices. And interestingly enough, for the sort of later part of the movement here, right when the wrist is bending and so forth, watchers were worse than players as well. So meaning players were better able to predict whether the shot was going in or out compared to journalists who had watched plenty of basketball but were not as experienced with actually taking those shots. So that's really nice data that suggests that yes, our own motor system can become activated when we watch the actions of others, and the better the match is, the better we are able to predict the outcomes of those actions. They took this even one step further and decided to measure activation in several different muscles in the hand. 2 of those muscles, these 2 data points and these 2 data points, were not related to actually releasing the basketball shot, but this muscle right here, the ADM, the abductor digiti minimi, which is a muscle that's basically right at the base of your pinky finger, is actually related to releasing the basketball shot. And as they measured activation in that muscle, they actually saw that the activation changed for when a shot was going in versus when a shot was not going in. They showed higher activation when the shot was going in, the expert players. Expert watchers, they saw no modulation in that muscle activity whatsoever. So this is really interesting because this suggests that as these expert players were watching those shots, their entire motor system basically became active. It was almost activated all the way up to their fingertips and barely fell short as if from performing the actions themselves. And then because of running those simulations, this actually led them to better be able to predict outcomes of actions. So altogether, all of this work on mirror neurons and expertise and so forth shows that there's a really, really tight connection between the perception of action and the production of our actions. The actions we can produce, we also perceive differently.